Hey, folks. Montana, Wisconsin, Colorado, Georgia, New York, Auburn, Maine. Hey, are you having a good day up there today? We're having a great day down here on the water, but um, the bugs, oh my heavens, the bugs have hit. So, I'm supposed to go for a walk later on with a friend, and I just said, you sure about the bugs? New Jersey, Ithaca, Western Mass, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Isn't this cool that we all come together from all over the country? There's so much that can be said about social media that is not good. But it's also just incredibly cool that we can do this from all over the country and all over the world, just by clicking a button. So all right, let me jump into, these new shorter format. Apparently, people really like the shorter format, but it does mean that I want to get on stuff more quickly. So let me jump in here with the big news, I guess, today is the election by the College of the Cardinals of a new pope. And the new pope was born in Chicago, and he did a lot of his work in Peru, where he became a citizen in 2015. And let me just tell you a little bit briefly, in case you're interested, about how one picks a pope. It's the pope is elected by the College of Cardinals, and this is a piece that I think is really interesting. The College of Cardinals is made up of cardinals who were not yet 80 years old on the day that the previous pope died. I do not know the history of the papacy at all, but boy, that's an interesting little tidbit, isn't it? I'd love to know how they came up with that. Anyway, so they have elected this man whose last name is Prevost, Robert Prevost, and who will take the name Pope Leo the something. I'm sorry, I don't remember which one. And the people have asked what that means in the United States. And I want to be very clear. I am not a scholar of Catholicism, or of other countries. I am a scholar of American politics. And so my approach to this is about American politics. And in that sense, it's a really interesting choice. And let me tell you why. It's an interesting choice because Prevost was a supporter of the previous pope, Pope Francis. And Pope Francis was a pope who was really working to modernize the church's social message. He was a Jesuit. The last pope was a Jesuit, and very into the ideas of the Jesuits, the idea of protecting the marginalized, and so on. And the Prevost Leo now is in that mold, but he's really interesting because the U.S. Catholic Church has a real deep rift in it, and it's a rift between those who followed Pope Francis quite willingly and those who are much more radical and are trying to use the traditionalist teachings of the Catholic Church to enforce right-wing politics, to say, we can't have abortion, women should be in the home, and so on. And the leaders of that are the ones who are the leaders of MAGA. So J.D. Vance, who is a convert to Catholicism, is part of that right-wing Catholic branch. And so many of the people in the so many Catholics in the MAGA community are part of that right-wing branch. So one of the ones who jumps to mind is Tom Holman, who is Trump's czar for the border, is very proud of his Catholic heritage, and he basically picked a fight with Pope Francis earlier on this year. So the big fight, of course, is over right-wing politics and the United States government's treatment of migrants as criminals. Pope Francis said, it's okay to say that you're going to protect your borders, but you can't criminalize these people, just deport them. And that's paraphrased, by the way. It's a letter to the American bishops that he published on February 10th. After J.D. Vance tried to use Catholic teachings to justify the administration's approach to deportations, or now it turns out to be renditions. But so for the College of Cardinals to choose a man in the mold of Francis, they have some doctrinal differences, but to choose a man like that is a declaration that they are not embracing the right-wing radical Catholicism that has been rising around the world, but it exercises such power in the United States. And that is likely, the fact he is an American or was born in the United States of America is likely a sign that they are trying to heal that rift in the United States and to try and bring the influence of the Catholic teachings onto those who are using it in what somebody like Pope Francis or now Pope Leo would consider quite radical and inappropriate ways. So that's a really interesting choice. And you're not probably going to hear a lot more from me about the Pope going forward because it's just not my turf. I can't, I just can't do that. But in addition to that, um, there's something else very interesting about that particular election. And again, speaking, I don't know what goes on through a cardinal's mind, so I cannot speak for them. But it seems to me, as an observer of American politics, that a really interesting development in the last 3 months has been that before Donald Trump took office in the United States of America, many countries were flirting with right-wing authoritarianism. Those parties were rising. They were increasingly powerful, and they were kind of being able to attract voters with, if you will, a wink and a nod. Oh, we're not really going to do that. Oh, that's not really what's going to happen. And with the ascension of Donald Trump and JD Vance to the White House, what you are seeing is that wink and a nod is suddenly people are actually seeing what it means to play footsie with authoritarianism. And they're watching the attacks on the United States. And all of a sudden, those right-wing authoritarian movements are falling apart. And it happened quite dramatically in Germany when the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, they did not do as well in the election that JD Vance and Elon Musk tried to put real pressure on them to succeed in. Then, of course, we get the election of Mark Carney in Canada, and Carney was not projected to win before Trump took office. And then, of course, he won quite handily. And now we also have the Vatican coming out and saying we are not going to go down the road of right-wing authoritarianism. And that's actually quite interesting coming from the Pope or coming from the College of Cardinals, because there was a strand in the United States. I'm sorry, I don't do Catholic history, but I do American history, and there's lots of Catholics in America. There is a strand of Catholicism in 20th century America that takes such a strong stand against communism that they end up embracing fascism. And they become really, it's a kind of a flash moment, and they become really instrumental in, for example, Joe McCarthy's tenure as the person who's trying to destroy communism in the United States. And they do break, the mainstream American Catholics do break from that. But there is this important moment when Catholics, at least in the United States, flirt with fascism. If you're interested in that, there is a book by a friend of mine, as well as a colleague, called The Nazis in Copley Square. And it is a story of the rise of Nazism and the role that Catholicism played in that. The person's name is Charles Gallagher, Father Charles Gallagher. And it's a really interesting book. So obviously the church has looked at this and said, we're not doing that again. We're going to push the other way. So that's it's an interesting and an important statement, I think, as well. All right. So that had to be done there. But now I'm going to answer some of your questions about what's going on in this moment. Let's start with the material I talked about last night in the Letters from an American. It was quite long. Sorry about that, but I wanted to make quite a clear record of it because it sounds like tinfoil hat stuff. And honestly, I think it is tinfoil hat stuff, except that it's got the power of the US government behind it now. So ideas that in the past would not have even gotten a hearing are now suddenly have the power of the government behind them. And one of the things in that I talked about was the fact that Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which once again is not an official agency, has been collecting Americans' data. And they're collecting data in order to create a master database, which they have suggested could be used for things like well, what they keep talking about is waste, fraud, and abuse, with the idea that they're finding, as you may remember seeing in the news, Social Security that was going to children, for example, which they thought was waste, fraud, and abuse. It turns out it was children who are getting benefits because their parents have died. But if you remember, they also talked about people who were collecting Social Security checks, and they were 150, and that was, they just simply didn't understand how to read the COBOL information when they said that. So they've talked about it being about waste, fraud, and abuse, but they have also talked about pulling these databases together to target undocumented immigrants, which caused a huge stink a few weeks ago when the IRS said that they would give access to their files to the Department of Government Efficiency agents, because the IRS has always told undocumented immigrants that they would not turn that material over, and that one of the ways to make it clear that they were eager to become good American citizens was to pay their taxes. So this was reneging on a promise that they had given in the past. So they've talked about using that master database in those two ways, but you are starting to see people like Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., saying he is going to find the causes of autism, which, by the way, have been studied for many years now by actual scientists. He's neither a doctor nor a scientist. He says he's going to find the causes himself very quickly by looking at a combination of insurance data, medical records, and the information from people's watches, that their health information. Now, of course, that's information that previously was siloed, so the government could not create master databases the way that authoritarian governments like China do. But you can see that they're trying to think about using this in different ways. That's a real problem. That's something to be very concerned about. There are laws against the use of our data that way. There's the Privacy Act of 1974 that says you have to have very strict controls over who has access to Americans' data. And those have not been honored. There are now more than 11 lawsuits against the Department of Government Efficiency and the administration for the misuse of our data. But that's something to be very concerned about. Somebody asked if it's possible to get that data back now that it has been taken. No, I don't think you can get the data back. You certainly can be careful about how it's used. But also remember that we don't know that that data has been fully compromised. And there have certainly been a lot of places where judges have said, no, you can't go get that data. So it's not clear yet what stage we're at, but that should definitely be on people's radar screens. And it's been on my radar screen since the beginning, simply because it was clear to me that when Musk appeared with people who were trying to access data, they weren't auditing. They weren't, and when they got rid of the inspectors general, for example, who do audits, or when they never talked about the fact the government actually has quite an effective department, the General Accountability Office, that always monitors for waste, fraud, and abuse, that in fact they were up to something else. And it appears that that's what they are up to. Now, the other thing I wrote about was the ways in which the administration is pushing Starlink. Starlink is a subsidiary of Elon Musk's SpaceX. SpaceX is that space exploration company that keeps trying to send rockets up to perfect the technology of rockets, eventually to get rockets that can go to Mars, because Elon Musk believes that he needs to settle Mars in order to save humanity. He has talked about, and he talked this week on the Fox News channel about how he's trying to save humanity from the explosion of the sun, or the expansion of the sun. I think that's a bit of a smokescreen. The sun is not going to expand to threaten the Earth for about 5 billion years, which is, not on my time horizon. But in fact, Musk has a much more thought out, longer argument about why he feels it's time to do interplanetary travel. But I don't think it was one he felt he could explain on the Fox News channel, so he didn't. But the reason that matters is because there is, behind this push to get to Mars, there is a vision of human society that is a rejection of the world that we have lived in for 400 years, the idea of countries and nation states that have their own laws and protect the people within them. People like Elon Musk and the tech guru Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel, who's the guy who invented PayPal, also a billionaire. Those tech oligarchs have a vision of society in which it is decentralized. There are not state governments, that is, country governments, but that there are people grouped according to technological groupings, technological states or city states, if you will, that are overseen by, but not by a democracy, but usually by some kind of an authoritarian leader. And I think you can imagine who they see as being that authoritarian leader. So when you think about SpaceX and Starlink, you have to realize there's this larger argument going on behind them. But the administration has put a lot of weight behind SpaceX, and which is developing these rockets. It has just recently put forward a budget that called for cutting about 25% of the budget that currently goes to NASA, but taking about $1 billion of the money that's left and giving it to SpaceX to go to Mars, or giving it to projects that are designed to go to Mars. One assumes that means SpaceX. And then the administration has also put a lot of weight behind Starlink. And Starlink, as I say, is this company that produces the satellites that manage the world's communication, or could manage the world's communication. And it has put weight behind them to the degree that Trump has halted or paused the expansion of rural broadband that went into place under President Joe Biden, clearly with the idea of instead of developing rural broadband, simply having rural areas use Starlink. As many of my neighbors here do. You know that I'm in somebody else's place because I don't have enough internet at my house in the woods to be able to do these kind of broadcasts. But in addition, two reporters from the Washington Post said yesterday that in order for countries to come to Trump to talk about future trade policies, the administration has made it very clear, the State Department has made it very clear that they consider it an act of goodwill to approve permits for Elon Musk's Starlink to manage the communications for that country. And India has fast-tracked its permissions to make that happen. Just 1% of India's commercial broadband would pay about $1 billion a year. So this is not little potatoes here. But even more important than that is that putting Elon Musk in charge of the world's communications makes him extraordinarily powerful. And the State Department has said, well, we don't want China to do it because that's the big competitor. And it seems to me there is a middle ground. I agree, you don't want any country to monopolize the communications around the world, simply because if you wanted to, for example, as Elon Musk threatened to do, if you wanted to hurt one side or another in a war, you could simply stop providing cell coverage for whichever side you don't like, which is something that Musk has threatened to do. And Europe has responded by saying, we will develop our own systems because we don't trust you. The problem is they're somewhat farther behind Musk's. But there's no reason that the United States government couldn't do that, except that they decided in 2015, I think it was maybe 2016, that it was better to go with Musk than it was to spend the money to do it through the government. And that, it seems to me, is an answer to, well, we don't want China to do it. I would say we also don't want a billionaire, the richest man in the world, to do it. We want to do it in a way that we have some control over who has access to that material. Anyway, so those were the two things you asked about. Somebody also asked me to explain crypto. I did that on Tuesday, and I did it pretty thoroughly on Tuesday. So you can go back and look at that video. But now let's take a look at some of the other questions that you asked and some that you didn't. So one of the things that I don't think we're talking about enough in this country is that Trump does not appear to be in control of his administration. And as proof of that, I will refer not only to the quotations from him. If you listen to him, he is incoherent. He can't put together a sentence. But he did not, for example, seem to have any idea about the history or the dangers of the increasing tensions between Pakistan and India. And he has repeatedly said to people he doesn't know what's going on. He said that he was not the person who agreed to the rendition flights of migrants from Venezuela to go to El Salvador back in early March. He said he didn't do that. His name is on it, but he said he didn't do it. Um, he said, which again, I jumped all over and it just didn't get a lot of curiosity, but who's really behind that? Again, it seems to me that probably Stephen Miller, his White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and Kristi Noem, his Secretary of Homeland Security, are behind those. But the president should know what's going on. In the last couple of days, he has said that he does not, he was not the person who was behind who he didn't know anything about the attempt to render migrants from Asia to Libya. That he said you'd have to ask the Homeland Security Secretary about that. And he clearly has absolutely no idea how tariffs work. Just absolutely no idea. It's a little mind-boggling because he seems to think that the fact he has essentially destroyed our trade with China is a good thing, because he says that means we're not going to spend money on Chinese goods, so we'll keep the money here. That's has absolutely nothing to do with how the economy works. I mean, I suppose that's true in a sense, except what that means is that we're not going to get the goods that we normally purchase from China. And anybody who works in a related field is looking at significant issues with their jobs. So I'm starting here by saying that Trump is not in good control of this administration, which, as I said the other day, brings up the question of who is in control of the administration. And I would suggest to you that there's a struggle going on between the MAGAs, who are really pushing on the idea of deporting or rendering to other countries any undocumented migrants. And that would be, as I say, Stephen Miller in the White House and Kristi Noem at the Department of Homeland Security. But then there is also the people who are trying to institute Project 2025, and that effort is being led by Russell Vought at the Office of Management and Budget. And then there are the tech bros who, the Elon Musk crew, who is looking at decimating the United States government because they want to create this new kind of network states and want to be able to gather the power of communications, artificial intelligence that is fed by these databases that they're pulling, and also but through cryptocurrency, in order to get rid of the idea of nation states and replace it with this new technological idea. Just to be clear, I don't think that's going to happen. I personally, I am not a technology person, but I don't think that Musk is going to be sending people to Mars by 2029, which is what he is saying now. But I do think that these technologies and the monopolization of these technologies by a very few individuals who appear to be trying to destroy the United States is not a good thing, and that they're going to do a lot of damage before they're stopped or before their mission falls apart. So that's kind of my stand on that. So if Trump is not in control, and those people are, and there may be other people as well, I'm just watching from outside. A lot of you have asked, why can't he be impeached now? And the answer to that is a historic one, of course. And that's that when the framers wrote the Constitution, they did not expect the rise of political parties. If you read Federalist Number 10, which I'm sure all of you had to do in high school, and you're thinking, what is this crap? Because honestly, it's really hard to read. If you're sitting here thinking that like there's some magic switch and suddenly historians can do that stuff easily, that's actually not the case. It's very difficult to read. But what Federalist Number 10 talks about is it talks about how he's very concerned about the rise of what he calls factions, and he meant parties. They didn't really have words for parties then. And what he argued was that Madison argued in Federalist Number 10 was that we didn't really have to worry too much about the rise of political parties in the United States because the country was so big, and that people would not divide into groups of two, as had seemed to have plagued British politics before the creation of the United States of America, but they would kind of splinter. They would all sort of, a whole bunch of people would agree on one thing for one issue, but then they'd split up and agree in different ways for something else, and that you would never really get the overriding power of a political party. And in fact, that's not what happened. We got the rise of political parties by, the 1790s, really, and by 1800, they're starting to skew the system. That's when we get the winner take all idea of the Electoral College is in 1800, and then of course it's going to spread through the 1830s. But what this means is when they set up safeguards around the rise of what they would have called the demagogue in their time, they didn't think that members of Congress would put party above country. And that's what we've got going on right now with the Republican Party, or what is now actually the MAGA Party. In the past, the way the system was supposed to work was that Congress people would take a look at a president who was running amok, and regardless of party, would say, we are going to protect our Constitution, which is, of course, what they say an oath to when they get sworn into office. And this is something that Angus King of Maine, the senator from Maine, keeps hammering on. As you swore an oath, uphold your oath. But they instead, what we are seeing is a MAGA party that is refusing to turn against Trump, not, I think, because they like him or like what he's doing, although some of them do. They are eager to continue to court his base. And I'm going to speak about that in a little bit more in a second. But the reason it's not worth trying to impeach him now, although certainly somebody has brought it up, is because right now the Republicans control the House of Representatives. They are not going to impeach him currently. Now, their margin is very, very small. And the thing is, in the House of Representatives, an impeachment vote will not, he will be impeached. That's what that means. And an impeachment is not breaking the law. It doesn't have to be. It simply says you committed high crimes and misdemeanors. And my great example of this is you could sit in the White House and just watch Bugs Bunny all day, and you could still be impeached because you're not actually doing your job. It's not against the law to watch Bugs Bunny. It's actually quite a good idea, but it's not doing your job. So you could be impeached for that, but then it goes to the Senate. And the Senate has to decide whether or not to convict the president under the charges of impeachment. And again, it's a Republican Senate, and they need more than a majority. They need, I think it's 60 votes to convict on articles of impeachment. And right now, those numbers simply are not there, which is why I put that where I did. Because again, I'm trying to keep these short now. This is why people's voices are so important, because what you are seeing right now in the polls and around the country is the collapse of Donald Trump's popularity, the extraordinary dislike of Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency. And if you're watching closely, what that's translating to is a number of Republican Congress people, both in the House and in the Senate, saying they will not go along with the things that the Trump administration is trying to do. And that pressure, I mean, so we're only 3 months into this administration. Continuing that pressure and to articulate what you actually care about, what you want to see done, is going to be increasingly important, because one of the things that I keep trying to emphasize is that politics is a moving target. So, when coming out of the box on January 20th, Trump and his people insisted he had a mandate and this was what popular and this is what people wanted. You're not hearing that anymore, are you? What you're hearing is them saying, well, this is what voters voted for. Well, no, we didn't. I mean, even if you're a Trump voter, you didn't think you were voting for the things that are now happening. Because if you remember, Trump promised different things to different constituencies. And so you could sort of a la carte it. I like that he's going to bring prices down, but oh no, he's not really going to deport my neighbor who's been in this country for 30 years. And now, of course, you're getting just the opposite of that. So in this moment, it's not a time in which impeachment is going to happen, but the place that people can make a real difference is continuing those phone calls, continuing to be in the street, continuing to run for office, continuing to show up to school board meetings and to town offices and to state offices, and making it very clear that this is not what you were hoping to get out of this administration. Let me see there. I think there was one more thing. Oh, and that was the final question. And that's a good place for me to end it. Is somebody asked, what increases voter turnout? turnout? And there's two answers to that. The first is pressure to increase access to the vote, because what we have seen since 1986 is voter suppression. And you see it in places like Texas and Pennsylvania and Florida and North Carolina. And you can tell, you don't need me to do this, and you don't need any fancy polls or anything else to tell this. You can tell when voter suppression is happening because the people in charge of the state start to take away drop boxes. They start to cut down on the hours of voting. They start to ask for new kinds of voter ID. If they are doing that, that says they don't want a lot of people to vote, because they know if a lot of people vote, they're going to lose. So when people talk about Texas or Florida as being red states, my answer is always they are voter suppression states. And you know that because Texas keeps taking away drop boxes. All right. So one of the things, pressure points here, is to demand that we get access to the vote, and also an end to gerrymandering, because that's another place that our votes are really being suppressed. So that's one answer. But the second answer is the one that is a daily project for people like me, and I think for a lot of you. In the 1850s, the 1890s, the 1930s, and now again in the present, people start to show up to vote when they understand that the government is not working on their behalf, and they can object to that, but also see an opportunity for a different kind of government. And it's really quite dramatic in the 1850s and quite dramatic again in the 1890s. That when people start to believe that democracy is under attack and that they are losing the principles that have made this country great, that's when they start to turn out. And the people who turned out for Abraham Lincoln were known as wide awakes. You might not have heard of them before. They were instrumental in getting people to turn out. They had picnics. They had picnics to go and be political, and they let ladies go. I'm not making that up. That's one of the reasons young men really turned out for the wide awakes, is they could go to picnics and meet ladies, meet girls. But you see this again in the 1890s, when you start to see labor organizations continuing to have bigger and bigger rallies, and publishing pamphlets and publishing broadsides, and the farmers movement publishing newspapers to make people understand that the government was not working for them. And that's the enterprise in which people like me are now engaged. It's trying to tell people what the world is really like, what is really happening, and encourage them to speak up, and to speak up on the issues that they care about. Not that I am telling people to go vote the way I want you to vote, but my theory is, and it's the same theory that Abraham Lincoln worked with, and that people worked with in the late 19th century when they stood against the robber barons, and that people like Francis Perkins and Franklin Delano Roosevelt operated under. And that's that if people are truly informed, really, about what is happening in their society, they will make good decisions about it. And so that's what I'll leave you with today. My job, I think, and to the degree that you are willing to talk and to share information and to encourage people to understand what is real, that job is the one that will enable us to reinforce the guardrails of our democracy, and to get people who really care about a government that works for us to show up, to make their voices heard, and eventually to vote. So thank you for being here, and we got a lot more up our sleeve at this channel and coming from me in the next couple of weeks. Thanks for being here.